There's this editorial from like 90s PM News that's like Oleku is back.
Oh wow.
And it's interesting. Like the Oleku skits.
Yeah.
What is that?
That was the only one.
Hi everyone.
Hi for what?
Hey.
This is the first Archivi.ng Roundtable. We're not going to get into the story of how I managed to get everyone here, but I'm happy everyone is here. Now, everybody here knows archiving, right? And the entire point of this conversation is people think of archiving and think of newspapers, but by the time this conversation is over, I want everyone to think of the unlimited utility of everything we're trying to do and accomplish at archiving. And I'm just going to get right into it and ask this first question. And this is a safe space. But what is the first thing you ever searched for on archiving? Ever?
I think I can go first.
Fantastic.
RMD's late wife was a journalist.
Yeah.
And, he talked about her a lot. And I was like, this is someone I should know. My mom even knew of her. So I was like ashamed that I don't know her. So I went to find some articles. I think that's the first thing I searched, on archive.
Did you share it with RMD?
No, I did. I should have, right?
Yeah, you should. You definitely should write
I
after this.
will. After this, I'll share it.
What's
I
the first
think I'll go next. So mine was actually Fela Kuti. And the background to this, so I worked on an article on the NSAT protest in 2020. And it was basically drawing the parallels between Fela's resistance in his time and also NSAS. And I remember when I was doing the research on the article, I went online. So I wanted old newspapers that showed me what the movement was like at the time. And I remember Googling and I only saw articles from the New York Times. And I was like, that's so interesting. We should have Nigerian papers that cover that. So I ended up having to buy his biography by Benson Idonije, and I just leaned heavily on that. So I remember when I heard archiving was live, the first thing I searched was Fela Kuti, and there were several news covers, like Fela on his way to the tribunal, Kalakuta reader today. It just gave me just a huge historical perspective. And again, that's why I feel like archiving is so important. The mandate of just archiving these papers is just so crucial. So that was the first thing I searched.
Safe space, yeah? Okay. So I think one of my theories about economies is that nothing really new happens. That it's all, if not cyclical, but you're going up a spiral, right? And Nigeria, more than ever, right? I mean, from 2015 to 2023, we had a president who had run the country in the past, right? So, I thought surely, from what I'm hearing, there are likely similarities in the narratives, the policies, in that era and in the early 80s. And I'd seen clips random, on Twitter, just seeing random clips from 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I said, okay, let me really find out how the economy was in that period, and crucially, what journalists and commentators were saying about policies at the time. So I just looked at a few, and it was actually quite stark how similar, right down to the headlines, right down to the kind of justifications that policymakers used for policies 40 years apart, right? It did make me happy, sort of validating the theory, but it also made me very sad, seeing how little we had progressed in our thinking, and crucially, how little we had learned from the past, which I think is what I really like about archiving, because it gives us that opportunity to do so.
Interesting. You are so smart.
Okay.
Afrobeats.
There is the entire conversation about the nomenclature, Afrobeats, Afropop, Afrobeats.
With S, without S.
Yeah. And so I was just curious how, the language of it and also the stories. Something I found really interesting was a lot more coverage across Nigeria of the different things musicians and artists were up to. So, yeah.
Interesting. Olumide.
I realized I didn't know anything about Nigeria, the history. I just knew, I thought I knew stuff, right? But it was incomplete. So one day I was working and then I started watching something on YouTube, one of the historical commentaries.
Yeah.
And I watched the first one. I was like, wow. And I watched the second one. And I stopped working that day. I started watching like a lot because I realized I didn't know anything. And for people that know me, know that I can become obsessive. So what happens is I get like a week where I'm not doing anything. The only videos I'm watching on YouTube in my spare time are just things around history. And that same week, I'd seen Archive on LinkedIn, and I met someone who was using it, and then the person came to my house. I was just, of course, just going on and on around. Oh, I didn't know this person was shot in this manner. Oh, Nigeria was just a crazy place. Like, oh, it was much worse then than it is now. And this person, and we started to search for stuff. Started to search for articles that confirmed some of the horrors that I had seen in just watching those commentaries. It was good and bad. I felt very sad for some of the things that had happened. Also very sad that I knew next to nothing around, how Nigeria had come to the place we are today. But then it also gave me perspective around some of the problems. It also made me think, we say this thing a lot. Even my Uber driver just coming here was like, oh, Nigeria don't spoil. Then it was very good. And I say it too, like my dad left Unilag, got a car, I'm like, but I also forget that he could have been shot.
That is true.
Nothing. So it was interesting for me to gain perspective to history.
Yeah. So I heard some great advice, which is stop whatever you're doing, take out a week, and just binge on archiving.
That's not how we put it, but
That's what I've chosen to hear. Okay, so when we wanted to start archiving, right, the big driver was a real pain, right? I used to work in a newsroom. I was also even planning to travel across West Africa at the time. And every time we tried to search for stuff, like to dig up historical context about like places we're going, it just was hard to find anything, right? And that just started this rabbit hole of like, this is the pain for me as a person. Who else is the pain for? And so I'm curious about like the specific ways in like your lives or the work you do where like archiving, like there's a pain point and archiving solves that pain point. Yeah.
Okay, let me go back to like talking about why I was even searching for Aramdi's wife's profile in the first place. So Aramdi was the lead character in the Black Book. I worked on that.
Never heard of that.
If you've not heard of the Black Book, it's a Netflix blockbuster. That was my first time in film PR. I've been in filmmaking in different like capacities, but I tried out my hands at film PR and it was a wonderful journey.
Great start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honestly. One thing I learned about the director Etiti was that he builds worlds. Like even before the actor comes on set, the set director, the costume, everybody has built the world to be believable enough that whatever the actor does is on brand. And there's a ton of research that goes into building worlds for a film like The Black Book. Because while those are fictional characters, they exist in real life, in our history books right there. There is a journalist getting shot, there is a person receiving a letter bomb, these are fictional characters, yes, as a DT, everyone will say. But if you look into the history books, there's definitely semblance to what we have gone through as a country. And so for him, how he talked about, building that world, he did a lot of the old way of finding out, like research, traveling to places and talking to human beings, the living ones, the ones that are still alive, talking to his dad, and RMD, the actor, also has like experience because his late wife was a journalist who had her life threatened for the work that she was doing. And so I just found it so fascinating how, a place, archiving just has like all the places that Edith traveled to. He may not have needed to do that if he had just that access to like an archive of newspapers. So that specific research in filmmaking, and not just the news actually, there's so many things like language, right? There is dressing because there's pictures too. There is just like all of the context. It's like the 80s frozen on the pages of that newspaper. You just pick up a lot of things. And honestly, from the set designer to the actor, to the director, to the producers, even the people who are the cast directors, even the people who are looking for actors, they know what they're looking for. They know the kind of bald head.
It's very interesting. I remember Politima's head.
Yeah.
When he was young, and it reminds me of a specific sub-lieutenant that flogged me.
Oh my
wow. Wow.
This is not just my trauma, right? This is just for archiving. Sub-lieutenant Odu. I wonder, it's probably a captain now, commodore.
Oh wow.
If you got decked by any commodore.
What?
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. That is very, very interesting. Anybody else pinpoint?
Yeah, I want to actually say a little bit about what Kiki said because I don't know much about film, the entertainment industry, but I do know quite a bit about capital, right? And industries in general. And naturally, when even great movies like The Black Book come out, you have Nigerians who their first instinct is to compare it to, but it's not Killers of the Flower Moon, but that scene this,
John Wick.
but John Wick, yes, the action scene was this and that, and then you have the people who are also a bit too lax, who are like, but give us time, we'll grow, we are young, right? So, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. But for me, what people fail to recognize that has just hit me as you and Kiki were speaking is what archiving does and how essentially making it easier for us to access our history, how that is a kind of capital that those in Hollywood, Bollywood have, that filmmakers and story and script writers here don't have, right? I remember reading very recently how Christopher Nolan got onto Oppenheimer and that whole story, right? And apparently it was just by chance and he just became obsessed with it. And, if I wanted to become an expert on that, I can spend a week just binging on it because it's there. There's access. I can go to libraries if I wanted to and get physical copies of things, right? If I want to be an expert on someone from Nigeria in 1967, it's going to take me a long time. I would need to do a lot more legwork, right? And when we judge our scriptwriters, directors, producers, and the people who are crafting stories, it's easy to forget the handicap that they're working with. So I'm looking forward to a day where it's easier for us. Because it's easier for us to access our histories, we can use that to build other stories that people can appreciate and we can sell to the world. Yeah. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
I mean, on the same point on being able to access our history, I think sometimes people forget the role of newspapers in a lot of resistance movements that we've seen in Nigeria. And I think Kiki said something about the 80s frozen, and that just reminds me of Newswatch by Dele Giwa. This was actually founded in 1985, and he was a journalist, he was speaking truth to power, speaking out against the government at the time, and it's like today, like the current generation, how do we access, these papers that were so important in our history? So I feel like platforms like Archiving are just great in that they're focused on that mission of keeping what is so important and bringing that history for this generation to be able to access.
Sorry, just to add, it's especially important for us, especially, the country that went through the military rule, because they tried so hard. Like what we're seeing right now is like the news that made it to the papers. They stifled the media so much. It's like, so what did they die for? Did they die to be erased, right? America has access to all of their history, which is good and fine for them. We even need it a lot more than them, because the things you erase, they die. And that's it. It's like a death of Nigeria.
Yeah, something I like to say is that, like generally with entities, an entity is only as aware as a knowledge of itself.
Yeah.
And when you think of like us without our knowledge, our own context, you really just start to ask like, what are we?
Yeah.
So definitely agree. Something very interesting that I also was thinking about, you're talking about old newspapers. When you said capital, you just switched it on in my head, is that by looking at old newspapers, the ads in newspapers is a story of like Nigerian enterprise. So you see the ads change over the decades.
Yeah.
I mean now it's like fintechs everywhere. 20 years ago it was like telcos. Right?
Yes, some common trends.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you think the trends are.
Safe space.
Safe space. Always safe.
I tell you, let's call them personal ads, Are you looking for a young woman? Looking for something enlargement?
We don't have them
They
anymore.
take different forms.
We have
but,
Twitter. Yeah.
So I want to take us on a tangent, right? But still connected, because I'm obsessed with predicting the future, right? And I feel like that's where my life is leading towards. And mathematical models that help us say this is exactly, this is where Nigeria is going to be, right, in 2025. I don't know if anyone has seen the series Foundations.
Psychohistory.
I love it so much because it's something that appeals to the science in me. And when I think about archiving, it is the perfect data set. Something I was thinking about, just coming on the way here was, we could predict what fashion is going to be in 2025. We could predict what fashion is going to be in 2030. If I had all the data as to how fashion has evolved, and I do believe in the theory that it is cyclic, but with certain disturbances or perturbations, but essentially it's like a cyclic. We will know what is coming back and when it is coming back. I can decide to start a company now that is investing in like big clothes because I know that in 2030 that is where we're going to be. And this is how archiving helps me solve this problem, because now I have all of the data from the past and I can use that data to predict the future in different aspects: financial future, terrorism future, even the points where a society breaks down, like where are we, like what needs to happen for us to start protesting.
When you said fashion, I actually remember there's this editorial from like 90s PM News that's like Oleku is back.
Oh wow.
And it's interesting, like the Oleku skirts.
What is that?
That was the only one.
No, it's like the short skirts and like buba.
I'm the new Gen Z here, so everyone is going to know. Like I'm Gen Z. Sure.
Yeah.
There's a case for archiving in media. I get it from the cultural perspective, from the pop perspective, the fashion, the music, but it's also the craft of it. I work with a bunch of writers, right? And I imagine what it would be like if they could read any article from 1960 that was written.
It's very interesting you say that, because as a person who writes, one of the most impactful writers to me personally is Gay Talis. And the reason he has had the impact he has had on me is because I read Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, which was published in the 60s. Like every time you stumble on old Nigerian editorial, like it is like the language is like mesmerizing. Even for so PM News, for example, which we have digitized extensively, like PM News is like relatively cheap compared to like the magazines, but even the language in PM News is like extremely profound. I was speaking to a newspaper historian, and one of the things I also learned is that the way it's even distributed has even affected like how we tell stories.
Yes. Yeah.
So when you're on a newspaper stand, you're responding to language that jumps out at you, right? I mean, now we write for the algorithm, search algorithm, and to be optimized for keywords and everything. But yes, like from a craft standpoint, I find that to write better, I find myself reading old editorial or things that draw from old editorial, so like magazine or like and all that. Yeah, totally agree with that.
Sorry. There's also the language of trends in general. That one is a personal, very specific interest because I can get quite obsessed with just how words flow and what they mean. And so just being able to access that, it feels monumental.
This is personal, but I love I love to look at old works because I feel like there's a deliberate slowness to the way they write. I feel right now everyone just wants to go straight to the point. Just wants to hit the nail on the head. There's nothing sexy anymore. It's just go. And then there was the tension, there was the leading, there was
the storytelling.
Storytelling was a key.
Like they take their time, they build up the story, they get to the middle, the plot, and then they wrap it up.
There's this newsletter I follow. It's called Letters of Note, and it's just letters of, I think of random people, but they just have maybe really strong stories or something really cute. I think of all the big guys as well, and the letters they share between themselves. And you read them and you're thinking, this is someone in their house, in their office, and they sound this way. And it's really beautiful. Just the way the words just get into each other, the intention.
Beautiful.
Talking about letters, right? I was at the National Archives in Ibadan, and I stumbled on a letter, like a colonial correspondence about like Lagos and like the administration of Lagos and everything. And it reinforced something for me. Now, the major reason why archiving is starting with newspapers is because like newspapers, like journalists actually have one job. They show up every day and file everything from the time. But like one of the things I also know is that newspapers are just the first step for us.
Very good.
If fundamentally our job is, we know there's a history vacuum, and if our job is to fill it up, it means we're going to collect everything. We're going to collect newspapers, magazines, and for example maps. I'm talking about maps.
Oh, interesting.
Olumide, just talk about your dad.
That is interesting.
Just talk about your dad.
My dad used to work at the Office of the Surveyor General of the Federation. I was one of the top people there. Grew up around maps, understanding how to use them, what they are, seeing all the maps of Nigeria everywhere in the house. What specifically do you want to
I'm actually curious about one thing that's happened a lot in Nigeria is one way that our map changes a lot is state creation. Right. First of all, it's like the sovereignty of Nigeria. So many people don't know, for example, that there's a Tafawa Balewa pitch to people of Northern Cameroon asking them to be part of Nigeria. That the map would have been very different.
Of course.
There's, like over the years, you see how like new states are created, for sometimes political reasons. And just even seeing how like that changes and how it has affected us. You see how an Imo person has this core sense of identity, and an Abia person has this sense of identity, even though they used to be one state. And I'm just curious about how you'd even think about the usefulness of digitizing a thing like maps, especially how they've changed over time.
Yeah.
Especially since you studied how things change over time.
And I watched them change. Like a lot of time, my dad will not be in the house because then, of course, there were no phones, and he would be somewhere trying to resolve a crisis. So we saw the Taraba Benue crisis where my dad left. In fact, because we couldn't reach him at some point, we thought he had died.
Oh, wow.
And we sort of moved on, and then he came back, and
We sort of moved on.
What year was this?
he was a kid. I was in primary school. I think I was in 95. That should be 95, 96,
Okay.
95. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. So over time, I think not just the maps, also the interactions that led to that leads to a map changing. There were a lot of time there are wars, there are battles, there are killings that before the government has to intervene to say, okay, we need to settle this. There was the one between the Tiv and the people of Buhari. At some point, when Niger State had to look at how the map of Niger and Kwara works, and I don't know if you know right now, there is Jeba North. I think that Jeba North is in Niger, and there's Jeba South that's in Kwara. It's weird and it's interesting. But one of the things that I see is these maps are changing. Right?
Yeah.
Even the time Nigeria had issues with Cameroon, I remember my dad had to go spend a lot of time in that region, just trying to do the surveys, saying this is Nigeria, this is Cameroon. And a lot of times people in Cameroon, some parts of Cameroon say, hey, we feel more Nigerian than Cameroon, then we don't speak French, we speak English. This has changed over time. Our maps have been redrawn, they're still being redrawn right now. Maybe not as they're not as many times as it used to be in the past, but a lot happened in the past. And I think just capturing the story, what I see is the map is essentially part of the story, right? The lead-ins to the redrawing and just capturing the entire process, I think just makes a lot of sense for us to understand how we became a nation today. Why is the North, why is the South? How many states there were. I can't tell you for sure. How Nigeria evolved, what state was what state. At some point, I got stuck on 30 states, and now I had to relearn the 36. So,
You were not born then.
so it's a journey that capturing it would allow us to be able to tell our stories ourselves and tell and capture all these moments as they've passed.
Yeah, sorry, this might not be super coherent. Apologies in advance. But we spoke about world building. And we spoke about maps. And quite literally, you can't build worlds properly without maps, right? I remember I finally caved into peer pressure. I said I'll finally buy one of these George R. R. Martin books and actually read one of them.
When I came into peer pressure, I became more cool.
But you loved it, right?
Yeah, it was great. It was Fire and Blood, right? Because I was going to watch The House of Dragon, right? And once you open the book, the first thing that you see is a map. That is a book with like 700 pages. The first thing he wants you to see is the map. And I don't think that is a mistake, right? Because that map is the foundation of the world. It's the foundation of everything else that follows, right? So it's very easy for people to think, oh, these are just 6 people just geeking out about maps, right? But there is a reason maps are so important. Land is not just land. There's an attachment that people have to their land, right? We are seeing it right now in the world, right? The biggest crises the world is facing are map crisis, right? So I'm really looking forward to that. I think if you think that you're shaking the table with newspapers, maps,
Try maps.
yeah, try maps. The kind of things that we will learn about Nigeria will be groundbreaking.
Just to add, I think it might also be a tangent. One of the reasons I love maps so much is that there's this mathematical theory that alludes to the fact that if you have a map, a scaled down version of a map, there's a point in the map and you place it on the floor, there's a point in that map that corresponds to the actual point. And I love it so much because, I don't know why, I just love it.
What's the name of the theory?
I forgot it. But it's on Instagram. I actually wrote a lot of
Still on formats, right? Kiki, you work you worked in like radio, right?
I have.
People forget that. I feel this remind everyone. When I first knew you, I knew you as a radio person before you came to Lagos and joined Band. And I'm curious about like what happens to like old tapes after that.
That's a good question.
It's very interesting that you would ask that, because recently I was just consulted on a film that's being made, a historical film, and people are trying to learn accents. Like whether we know it or not, our accent has changed a little over the years. And so we're looking for how, for example, broadcasters used to make announcements. There's a thing we call NTA accents. Those things, whether we like it or not, they're just like an interesting. Have you watched a video of maybe like one of the people on your Naira notes, just any random one that you just expect will have one accent, and then you hear them speaking, you're like, what is this? Right?
Tafawa Balewa was a big one.
A very good example.
Oh my God.
It's the one I was just like, wow.
I didn't know that.
Africa.
It's like, is this a voiceover?
Like at a point, maybe when Buhari was your president or Tinubu,
Buhari had fantastic accents.
he
Watch
did.
his Nigeria
I will not
Oh.
be commenting on or whether it's fantastic or not. It's just accent is accent. But you just be like, wow, there's a shift. And even because Nigeria is even very diverse, like super diverse. We have hundreds. I used to know the number when I was in primary school. I think 300 and something tribes. Or 100
I mean,
and
it depends on
something.
how you count, but it's as high as like over 500.
Okay,
I
great.
think about 2 years ago,
700.
9 are now extinct.
That is
Taraba has like 50 alone, over 50 alone.
I think it's
Most diverse.
725 or so. Yeah.
Like all of Nigeria.
725.
Yeah.
That's what I that figure, so I'll take
I
your word
think,
for it.
Kola is going to be really disappointed if he sees this video. But yeah, like it's a lot of languages.
Hey guys, before you go, I'm still stuck on the map point because I've just been thinking about one specific scenario, and it's tied a little bit to the Black Book. But this is literature focused because I'm realizing now that there will be so many more experiments for under fantasy and even creative non-fiction if there were clear maps. And I'm saying this because there are drafts that I've edited that could not be accepted because where the world building, which is supposed to be, in Nigeria or is tied to some physical location, doesn't quite make sense, and you can see the writer struggling to. This person is moving from point A to B, like, oh, it's a river flowing, and so just that access, what it would do to the creativity for literature.
Oh my God.
That's
For
where I'm
literature,
yes, specifically.
You
for
might need to
literature.
even go back to pre-Nigeria
Yes.
maps, because I saw a map in my grandfather's library. It was a map of Benin Kingdom. And that Benin Kingdom, it doesn't sound to me like, I know Benin City. I've been to probably every edge of Benin City, Edo State in fact. And the map I saw is kind of different. It feels like it extended across the Niger, across to like other
Exactly.
countries.
Yeah.
So like I just, if we start talking about maps, you talk about Nigeria, you talk about what it looked like before it became Nigeria. It was probably like this. Nigeria is like this. The map was probably like this because that's how people traveled across the river, across the water.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's how people migrate. And so when you think of language, you see it going across. But then Nigeria is just the opposite direction. And that's why when we studied conflict, when we tried to document all the conflicts in the 6 geopolitical zones, the number one thing there was just the conflict of how these people, they're not supposed to be together, but because the British came and forced them to be together, they had to fight for resources, fight for language, dominance of culture, etc. So the map actually, there is, oh
Yeah,
my God.
there-
Let me
yeah,
start
just
geeking
on-
out. Let's even talk about Lagos. The map of Lagos in my own lifetime, I'm just like in my 30s, has changed.
Yeah.
They've sandfilled some places.
Yeah.
And when we start having environmental problems in the future, we would like to be able to reference what Nigeria looked like before, what it looked like at some point, and what it looks like now, and why it's happening. the geologists would need to know, that, okay, maybe we're not calculating the actual mass or the actual area.
I was going to say, on the point of maps, like when you think about the fact that countries like the UK and the US, you can literally Google, what did the UK look like in 1940 something, and you will see that map, and we don't have that. And just think of what that could do to our development, just having access to the past and what it looked like and what different regions look like. And I think the insights from that could also go into planning, so we don't keep making the same mistakes when it comes to urban planning, particularly in Lagos, like you mentioned.
The power of just knowing exactly where you're from. I think it's one thing that people from Benin have, because they know exactly.
Shout out to Sally Poppy.
No, I love
that
Benin
just
culture.
being there for everyone. I think it would take a lot of just tribal, ruckus. Tone it down a bit, because you know exactly what the story is and not your version of it.
To bring us back to archiving's clear and present problems, I like to think of it in 2 buckets. But if I talk about those buckets, I'll talk about the progress we've made. We've broken our work into 3 phases. The first phase is to focus on digitizing at least 1 newspaper a day for every period from January 1, 1960 to December 31st, 2010. That's roughly 18,627 days. Not roughly, think about that number a lot. So we've only done about 24% of that. And there are all kinds of problems we've been running into. The first one is resources. It is expensive and time-consuming work. The second one is access. So you have copyright law issues. I mean, first of all, everyone here is obviously going to drop like 10 million each. But the access problem, I'd like to hear what you think about that too.
So a major issue, from a legal perspective, when it comes to archiving old newspapers, is copyright. Because at the end of the day, these newspapers, that's copyrighted content. And it's very important that there are clear licensing agreements with these publishers so that there are no legal issues in the future. However, a lot of the copyright laws in countries have something called fair use. And fair use basically creates the room for you to use copyrighted content without necessarily needing the permission of, the owner or the creator. But there are also very specific parameters that you need to be within. So it has to be for educational purposes or research or a non-profit. There's something like transformative use. It mustn't affect the market value of the original content. I'm sure some of you have heard of the OpenAI versus New York Times case. And that's exactly what they're arguing. They're saying that OpenAI is training models on content that should be behind the paywall, normally of the New York Times. So that's affecting the market value. But the good thing is, under Nigerian copyright law, we also have the term called fair dealing. So that does allow for this type of content that's educational, Fuad is smiling, already publicly available, and basically just improving research and scholarship in general. But I think there's also a lot of work that needs to happen when it comes to policy development. So we have the National Archives Act that's supposed to be for archiving of public records. You mentioned you were in Ibadan, so there's the...
A couple of them, Ibadan, Sokoto, Abuja, Lagos.
So there are national archives all over the country. A lot of people don't even know that this exists.
It's really interesting because, and just to cut you off a little before you get back on it, it's what I discovered by accident, right? I was re-entering Nigeria through Niger, Sokoto. And I just branched at the National Archives, Usman Afodi Library Archives in Sokoto. And I just saw a couple of newspaper bounds, Tribune, 1983 or 4. And I was like, this is so impressive. You guys have this. And they're like, yeah, every national archive across the country, over 6 of them have it. And of course, went down that rabbit hole, discovered that it was the first national archive was founded by Kenneth Dike. Shout out to Kenneth Dike. This is what's the word? Project. In the 1950s, he was the VC of UI at the time. He tested it in Ibadan and scaled the model across the entire country. Shout out to him again. Yeah, so many of us don't know, and I was one of them. So yeah, so you're saying.
Yeah, and exactly on your point, like there's a lot of policy development that's needed in that area. And you mentioned this earlier, so we need more allocation of resources to archiving in general. So I think one major issue is the fact that it's actually a department under the Ministry of Information. So because of that, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy in order to get things done. Another thing that's needed is enough awareness, again, like stakeholder engagement. So we actually even know that these archives are there. And I think the most important point, something that needs to happen, is partnerships with the private sector. So partnerships with professionals. A lot of the time, these archives actually have a lot of information that goes back years, but they're there in very poor condition. So we need to bring in like private sector people, like actually professionals, archivists, librarians, historians, people that not only understand archiving as a practice, but also the challenges that you could face with archiving and how to solve that as well.
Interesting. Random fun fact: the oldest Nigerian newspaper I have set my eyes on is Iwe Rain. It was published in 1859.
Wow.
1859. Yes, and it's
Wow.
so nice to just like search on archiving one day and I'm there. So nice.
Wow.
One question that comes to mind though is what is the length of time in Nigeria that an article can be bound by copyright laws? Is it infinite?
I think we're in the 70 years WhatsApp group.
Yeah. What do you?
Yes, generally,
Like, I mean,
copyright,
like,
trademark,
Yeah, trademark
Yeah.
they span.
it's time bound.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think we're in the 70 years WhatsApp group because a lot of our copyright laws are like basically the things that we picked from the Berne Convention,
Okay.
the 1800s, which we picked from the British. So even the law, for example,
Yeah.
that requires that publishers send their newspapers to
Yeah.
libraries was inherited from the British.
Yeah. A lot of it is just incorporated from their law.
Yeah.
mean-
Okay. Yeah.
Speaking on challenges, and this is quite obvious, so apologies also if it kills the vibe. But you raised some really important policy, I guess, government-related issues, right? I think about incentives, and they do worry, right? Because in safe space, definitely there are a lot of government agents, a lot of policymakers, there are a lot of people in power who are incentivized to keep our history dark, right? And some of these people are also the ones who actually hold authority over the legal decisions and also hold the budgets in some cases,
Yeah.
right? And actually thinking about how to deal with those incentives is very important because one thing that surely everybody has learned in life is that the most powerful force on earth is somebody who is defending the thing that gives him food to eat every day. There's no amount of morality or anything or justice. There's nothing that sway or influence that person if their daily bread depends on the status quo being maintained, right?
Yeah.
So for me in practice, right, because, and I also say this because in Nigeria, I think oftentimes we resort too much to how can we fix it from a legal and policy stance and forget that the legal and policy status quo is often not the problem. The problem is the execution, is the implementation, the village incentives, right? So while we deal, I do think that yes, there's a lot to deal with on the policy side. While we deal with that, how do we ensure that when there is budgets for this data under the Ministry of Information, that budget actually makes a
goes
difference
to-
and you don't read the fine line and see, oh, they're using it to buy commas and do accounts, right? Because how many people actually read page 395 of the Ministry of Information budget?
Yeah.
Because like we just wanted to scan newspapers, right?
Yeah.
Was here we are talking about policy.
That's a very good point. Like, but what are some of the solutions that you think would be to that issue?
Safe space still.
So in the words of didn't really say it, but you said something like it. I can guarantee safe space. But yeah, safe space. Safe space.
So,
For
from
now.
a very cynical perspective, right? You need to still make sure that people eat somehow.
No.
That's the reality. You need to make sure that people eat somehow. I'm keeping it as ambiguous as I can, but I don't believe that you can win just by your idealism, your rightness, your this, your that, you need to make the right deals, you need to do the right things. I'm not speaking specifically for archiving because I do think that is a multi-stakeholder task.
Yeah.
But 100% right, once we are aware that there are vested interests, once we are aware that actually, even if legal or policy change comes, that doesn't make a difference. Or once we become aware that to get that policy change, we need to make sure that people eat. It's a case of how does that work? How do we still achieve our goals and not give up who we are and still make sure we can get this over the line, right? So what that looks like, I don't know, right? But the idea that, everybody will align because this is the way the country should go and this was good for us. I hope, we don't hold on to those of this. I was actually quite curious if there are models of this kind of thing that perhaps you've been inspired by outside Nigeria, maybe in the past, maybe I'm even speaking like thousands of years ago, or maybe like Asia, Latin America, or I'll go first.
Yeah, there are a couple of examples, all in like prosperous countries.
That's caveat.
So first of all, right, there's a Nigerian phenomenon I'm very, very fascinated by, and it is missing penises. But like the oldest story you find on the internet outside of JSTOR about missing penises is December 1973, the New York Times.
Always the New York Times.
Because they have like
Extensive.
New
Everything.
York Times moat is the archives. That's why they'll take OpenAI to court for it. Because without the archives, there's no moat.
Yeah.
There is like British Library. There is Library of Congress. Like these, like there's
So I'm more interested in more private.
exactly. So a lot of the time, because you have governments that are like super invested in this already, like as with most things in Nigeria and like emerging markets, I imagine like private entities need to step in before like government catches up. There is of course newspapers.com. Super extensive. But again, it's extensive because there's already like foundational like public sector like infrastructure policy that helps them like succeed. For example, there's this website called there's this product called Ancestry.com. And Ancestry is just invested in digging up people's ancestry, right? One went live in October 2023. I saw someone tweeted like an image of a newspaper like ad that was taken out for her ancestor who had died about 100 years ago. The ad was from 1995. Like, I had no idea that was ever going to happen, which now brings me to another question. I'm curious about some unexpected use cases that you think of in the context of archiving.
Recently, when I was young, my grandpa, she was so proud of my mom.
Yeah.
Because my mom was a sportswoman. She played handball, basketball, football. She went regional. She went to Ibadan. Like, she was from Delta State. She went to Ibadan to play. She played with the boys.
Yeah.
Because there was no female team, so she had to play with the boys. And she would always tell me about the story. I was young, and I just randomly remembered it. I'm like, and I searched Google if my mom's name was there. Her name wasn't there. And she's a sports superstar. Because I was actually working for Document Women, and I was trying to document women in sports. I'm like, my mom is a woman in sports. Like, and I checked, I didn't find it. I checked archiving, I didn't find it either.
Yeah. I'll explain.
Well, I was so sad. That's just personal use case. I want to learn more about the work that my mom did.
It's actually quite common for people to first search for their parents. For now, archiving still leaves them mostly disappointed because they don't find anything.
Yeah.
And that's because like our so for the first phase of the work, 1960 to 2010, we've only covered like 24% of that period. So like roughly 17 years from the 1990s, mid 90s to 2010. But when we go way back, we're going to find your mommy. Especially, like, I imagine that she's going to be somewhere in the pages of National Observer. National Observer was a Bendel-esque, Bendel-ish newspaper, and their coverage of their editorials were really good. National Observer had really, really great editorial. Most of them did, to be honest. And so we're going to fix that's problem.
Yes, please find it.
Yeah,
there's a picture. I have a memory of the picture because my granddad kept the newspaper.
Yeah,
and she looked just like me. so I don't mind having that. I need the pictures.
How's your leg over?
Terrible. Obviously, she's ashamed of me.
What
obviously.
disappointment.
I know.
Okay, so use cases.
I think.
what's
You can go.
Another reason I'm now listening for archiving to now learn about my ancestry because I have a very interesting son, but I don't know anything about it. And family. So yeah, I'm rooting for you a little bit more now. For use cases, parties. There are people, especially older millennials. Older millennials and boomers will always tell how they were the party animals and we are just like South. What is South? Right? So I want to know what they were up to. I want to know about their olekos and boogie downs and, games. But I also have a specific interest in highlight because it was at an all-time high in the and so I'm very interested. And those guys travel the world. And so I'm just interested in the editorial of how those parties went, and how those events and performances went, and how they were covered as well. Did people in Nigeria like it, or are they like, oh, these guys were getting something?
There's this interesting photo in National Observer. It's about a fella like tour in London, I think it was London, and there's like fella is performing and there's someone standing beside him, and the way he tilts his head and the way like his beard is on his face, you can just tell this person is Bonaboy's grandfather. It's just so well.
That's probably Benson in Indonesia.
But I actually don't care. I know that we're talking about Bonaboy's father.
I don't understand.
I want to read about the funkies.
Yes.
Bands like that.
Those psychedelic rock posts.
Yes.
Nigerian Civil
And
War.
Fuji bands as well.
Yes. Yeah. Fuji. Like many people don't realize that before there was Wizkid, there was Kwamon. He has been performing since he was a kid, like an actual kid. And like there's extensive coverage about like Kwamon, about baristas, the old days. And rivalry between like unexpected rivalries, like people comparing KSC and Fela.
What?
One more in this case. This one is work related, but like sex stories.
What?
In Nigeria.
So now in the context of your work. Yes.
What work?
I'm the editor-in-chief of Zikoko.
So you would like just about sex or
No. We talk about a bunch we talk about Nigerian culture, the things Nigerians are into and love and are delighted by. And sex is,
Nigerians we have a long history with
That is strange
relationship. So there's a column by Bumi Shofola. Interestingly, it's Ore's auntie.
Oh, what?
Ore that used to be at Softcom.
Oh yeah, alright.
So it's so random. I just asked her,
So random.
Is by any chance, like if I was like,
Yes, auntie. Is it the agony aunt one?
so she wrote Agony Ants, and Agony Ants are like this big thing historically, right?
It was
there's so much material there, but she wrote this particular column about a party and how she was at the party with men, and like many of these men were with women that were not their wives, and she was talking about how one time a woman dialed up her husband's like side chick to rant. And the man on the other side was like, relax. When I'm done with him, I'll send him back home. And this was 1973.
Not much has changed, I guess.
Add to your woman think of list of things to drag women's for.
That's savage.
Wow.
I would describe this for archiving as challenging assumptions because there's a lot.
I like that intellectual.
There's a lot that we just say, oh, it never used to be like this, and oh, but this, like.
Mommy, come and explain.
Come and explain. You even see her in the comments, and they would email us. They would not email. Sorry. Oh my god.
They send like
They would mail
Vox Pop,
responses.
yeah. They would email it. Yeah, that was interesting.
They were so into it.
Yeah.
One use case, sorry, it's not as fun as what you have just given us up. But I'm very interested in globalization and social media and the internet. I think there's, I don't think this is me, but clearly there's life pre-internet and social media and post. Things will never be the same again.
Yeah.
I should not be knowing what someone in Texas thinks on the spots.
Bro.
It's a problem. So I am interested in seeing to what extent two things, right? One is in the 60s, 70s, 80s when people were in more silence, right? If you were in Nigeria, that if you were in those states, you knew a lot of what was going on in Edo. You didn't know much about the country, you definitely didn't know much about the world. You were hearing music, right? So interested to see how conversations were different. Right? So I feel not quite a bit, a little bit of a discourse generally shaped by what's going on abroad, shaped by the behemoth that is the US and their soft culture influence, right? I don't think that has always been the case. So I'm curious to see what did we talk about? How did we talk about it? How did we think about it, right? Even something like feminism, right? I don't think feminism just started in Nigeria because we bought it and we saw, there are feminists abroad, let's be feminists. I do think 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were 20s. They were women who at the time, even if they didn't have the reference, they thought something different. I am doing things. Yes, I'm like, I want to see the way they spoke about it and the way they pushed it and the way that was different from US and UK and Germany and so on. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I'm also then interested in seeing how those who had more access to the world then sort of the lenses and the frames that they use to then filter information through to us. Because now you don't need to wait for NTA to tell you what's going on in Ghana or China. You can go on BBC yourself, you can go on Twitter. But again, back in the day, it was like one source of information and everybody had to believe it as well, right? I mean, Gaza, that's a great example where probably for the first time a lot of young people are seeing that the truth is really influenced by who is telling it, right? And it's making them question, so what I read in my history textbook about this thing, maybe it was not as clear cut, right? And I do think that just to close, in terms of challenges, that's probably the cultural one I'm most interested in seeing how you navigate, right? Because we have sometimes spoken about history as if it is one thing. But history, any year is multiple sides and multiple stories. And the more you dig up, the more you reveal that. Right? So there's a lot about our history from if our parents were actually as good as they say, to just a lot of the narratives that we believe, that we take as given about Nigeria, about states, about who was really good or bad, that may actually become challenged. Right? Because now we have context, so we can assess situations and know, no, that guy is not really as good, or this lady is not really as bad. So I'm really interested in seeing how that rocks people, but also a bit worried because sometimes I feel those who document history are held responsible for it. Right? So those who reveal it may then have to face up to that.
Can I respond to that? So I have a written ODY of archiving, and I have a delivers closest to real-time context. So I thought about this when we're talking about challenges, and some of my brain was just like, so archiving isn't really, responding to the one source of truth. It's not saying this is exactly what happened. It's if archiving documents PM News and documents Newswatch and documents this and that, I mean, when you start to study data of it, you can pull, okay, this is what is most likely the truth. But even then, you can't still say it's the truth, but it's the closest you will get to objectivity, to be honest, in this time. But it also, I then have another question, so you can still respond to both of us, which is when we started, you mentioned a bunch of numbers. Sorry, numbers will stick in my head, but I know you mentioned a bunch. And one was about the number of stories or number of prints you were expecting to do. Now, there are no absolutes. You most likely will not get all of it. When is it enough? Do you have a sense of?
5 million pages. Okay, so first of all, when I think about the first phase of our work, right, I think of it first of all as opening a window to what is possible. We have this dark house called Nigeria and our history, and we know next to nothing about it. So we are opening a window from 1960 to 2010, right? A small window, which is one newspaper a day for this entire period, right? Now, the next phase of that is that you can't access a house with one window. So we are going to open it up by digitizing more newspapers across various regions in various languages, right? And so what that does for us is that it helps us like attempt a very, very clear picture of like what the world looked like. How did Gaskia Kwabo, yes, it's an author newspaper that became New Nigerian. How did they write about Nigeria? How did they write about North? How did National Observer write about Bendel? How did Tribune make the case and argument for like free education in the Southwest? How did West African pilots cover the Eastern region and all of that? So like those perspectives will continue to matter. Tunrie Bisi-Afolabi, one of the most prolific historians in the world, said like hammers or something. If you read his work, he says history is very revisionist. We are revising it every time we digitize and expand the archives. We are revising it and changing like what we establish as truth. It's also very humbling because it's actually quite profound to go into work, stumbling on what you consider a truth, and knowing in your heart of hearts that it's going to change a few thousand pages later. But back to 5 million pages. The rough math is that technically we've made only 1% progress because we've digitized a little over 50,000 pages that are now accessible. When I think about our future, digitizing over 30 Nigerian newspapers, digitizing maps across different times and locations, digitizing magazines right across every language. You had magazines that were focused on covering just like the North Central, right? That we stumbled on. Extensive coverage about what's happening in the Utility Press currently. If we go as far back as 1859, right, and digitize everything, my rough estimate is that we're going to land somewhere between 3 to 5 million pages.
Still
Yes.
Does anybody else have any use cases?
I do have a ton of use cases.
I am.
I think first of all, a personal use case for me would be to find out more about where I'm from. My granddad died before my dad was born. My grandmom was around maybe 7 months pregnant, and then he died. And so there's a disconnect to the family. And sometimes you see the surname pop up, but you're like, I don't know who you are. I've never had, there's that disconnect. So it would be interesting to see, in terms of timelines, how the name had popped up in history, who are the people that have been involved, sort of like an ancestry.com, but me doing the work myself, right? There are a ton of use cases in AI, and products. I could go on for the next 1 hour and things it could build on top of the data. It could, if you want to, maybe I start with the fun one, you could build something around the gist from the past, for instance. Someone could wake up one day and say, hey, every week I just want to serenade my guests with just some weird story from the past. And that just becomes something that, captures people's hearts. They will really want to hear stories that they know it's not from this time, but they're really interested in. We could think about, teaching history, for instance. One of the things we could do also to continue the conversation of fair use would be get an AI model, put it on top of it, and then or just build a product directly out of it, and then you could have question and answer for history.
And kids could leverage this and learn about history. You could say get type of question, just like a chat GPT but for us, right? Built on top of the data. And you have questions. You could have a tutor that just teaches you in timelines, what happened. You could learn about the Civil War. You could learn about how we got to 36 states, and you could have this model, lead you through the entire history. We could have another fun one I thought about was I could just build a model on top of the data and just have an AI writer that writes like someone from 1960. I could have a 1960 writer, a 1970 writer, a 1980 writer, and just have fun with all of them, right?
Get them to talk to each other.
Get them to talk to each other, right? Now you could have that, and then you say, "Hey, I want to write an article about sound 1960."
That's
fun.
really cool.
Film.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Or how
really
did someone from 1960 say this? And we could have that.
When
I
you
said
start saying decrease.
It's true. When do we start saying
right? And those are the things that we could build on top of. Apart from that, I am very much interested in, like I said, predicting the future, and you could start to gather data on things that have happened before pivotal moments in history. What was the news? How did they come together? And you could start to track those things, and this would help you understand what the future might be like. And it might just be building something around financial models. For instance, I know that the stock exchange right now is very much interested in knowing, is my stock going to rise, or what is the index going to be like? All of this is connected to the news. All of this, I know that Nigerian stocks are not as responsive as they should be, but in the end, they still respond. It is still a parameter, right?
Yeah.
And having that parameter nailed down means that you could pipe that into firms that are into investments and they could start to gain knowledge as to how stocks that have been in certain news cycles, how they've responded to the news, right? And these are just different applications. You want to continue?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned AI models. So something I've been thinking of is, imagine if you could ask, archiving, like just type in like for today. So what happened 28th January in 1922? Like what were the top news headlines? And it could actually say that back to you, like in audio. I think that would be really, really cool. Something that's also interesting, a few days ago, I was actually researching foreign exchange policy. And I was trying to find historical trends. And I think the importance is the past enables us to understand the present and just ensure that we don't make the same mistakes in the future. And it's interesting, I went on archiving and I put in foreign exchange policy and I saw all these news headlines from like 10, 20 years ago. But it wasn't any different from what we're seeing today. So it's like we're just making the same economic mistakes over and over again.
I'm not there.
It look like it's on purpose.
So it was just like, wow, like things like, Nigeria's foreign exchange reserves dwindling, on the front cover. It's like, the same thing over and over again. Another thing that is so important to me is just our curriculum in schools when it comes to our history. And it's amazing how much propaganda was introduced into our curriculum. So there's so much that we're actually not taught in schools. So it'll be interesting to use like these newspaper articles and archiving to actually have like front row access into some of these historical events. And, hopefully at some point it's being introduced into curriculum. So students are actually having more accurate representations of what happened and not something that has been, whitewashed or, covered with a lot of propaganda. So those are 3 use cases.
I have a couple. First, that piggyback off what you said about foreign exchange policy. So work at Standards, and one of the things that we're known for hopefully is data and numbers, right? And people often say things like, there's not enough data in Nigeria. Because of my job, after I say, yes, there's not enough data in Nigeria. But I don't think that that's the only problem, right? I can go online and get data on Nigeria's foreign exchange from now to So the exchange rate from now all the way back to 1965. I can get data on our imports in dollars from now all the way back to 19. It take me a while, but I'll get it. But what I'm missing is the context around that, right? Which is why I really loved what you said about the biggest use case for me of archiving is closest thing to real-time context. Because what we pride ourselves at Stairs isn't just that we're giving numbers, right? But it's because we can interpret those numbers in context, right? Because without that context, it's nothing, right? So it's, when I think back about people say, I mean, there's a classic, when we were in the 1960s, before oil became dominant, the eastern region exported this, the southern region exported this, where cocoa with this. I'm like, that's very headliney. What was really going on, right? Because then you get a policymaker come back in and say, I want us to become cocoa exporters again. Because they saw one headline that we were the largest exporter of cocoa in 1959. But I'm like, what was the context, right? And I cannot get that information, except I go to somebody who was around and in that industry at the time. There's absolutely no way. Or there's some random researcher in Harvard who was like 30 at the time that did their thesis on Nigeria at the time, right? So being able to access all that contextual information about the economy, for me, is necessary for us to make better economic decisions, right? That's huge, right? On a more playful side, actually,
That was not clear.
play for me, I'm not sure everybody. Nigerians love football. I mean, Olumide, you're wearing an Arsenal jersey, and specifically, I'm very interested in understanding how that happened. How did us? I mean, we hear things about Wanko, Kamwan, Thierry Henry, and Arsene guys, our daddy, and all those things. But I'm very interested in figuring out by reading, how did these very foreign, very British, very local British things infiltrate our culture to such an extent that we are arguably bigger fans than they are now.
We have us now.
Just to give an example, I became an Arsenal fan a very long time ago. But then one final was played in 2004.
2006, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Against Barcelona.
Yeah. And I was in Mina at the time. My God, the streets were covered Arsenal color. A couple of people repainted their cars to have the Arsenal logo. Yeah.
Whoa.
And this is
Mina.
And then Arsenal lost.
Yeah.
we lost. Yeah. I mean, you didn't have to say that.
So just seeing how the media shaped that, right? Because especially when you think about, again, the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where not all of this was directly consumed by people. Some of it was radio, some were newspapers, but people were not always just watching the games themselves. So it's like seeing how all of that shaped. Like, why was it Arsenal? Again, I'm pretty sure Khan was a big part of that, and there's more, but why him? Why, what was it about it, right? Because it's such a big part of our culture now that we take for granted, right? So that's another one now. But on a more positive note, right? Because I feel, again, as we've been speaking, there's been a tendency to hint that history is going to reveal bad. It's going to reveal the truth of our darkness and all those things, right? And yeah, likely going to be the case. But I do look around Nigeria today, and with all due respect, there's very little to be hopeful about the future. So to build my reserves of hope, I want to go back. And specifically, I want to identify one thing. I want to identify a wall of heroes. I'm not talking about the big names. There's God, I'm talking about relatively everyday people. The Kikis and the this and the that, who did things for Nigeria in little to medium-sized ways that made a difference, at least at the time, right? Because I think young people especially need to be reminded that people have fought for this country in ways that may not seem obvious, and that inspiration is important, right? Who were the people who stood up in business, right? Who were the people who did it in politics, right? In media, right? So I really love that wall of heroes. Thousands of Nigerians from all over the country showing that actually we are good. We can be good. It's just the environment that has made us who we are, right? So that for me would be fantastic.
Yeah, someone should take notes like archiving / wall of heroes.
I resonate deeply with the everyday people
Yeah.
perspective.
Me
Very,
too.
very
Yeah.
deeply.
Okay. Okay.
I'm actually thinking about the social element to that, where we identify a wall of heroes and then we keep a running list of wall of heroes, and then people right now are doing a lot of good just because at some point they want to get into that.
Like Forbes 30 and 30.
Only this one doesn't lead you to crime.
You want to say it, but
I want to say a use case for a friend, on behalf of a friend who he's a designer and he's obsessed with fonts. He just there's a lot of storytelling for him. The BBC, the fonts they use, the newspapers, the fonts we use for adverts, and it's just I mean, it could be. I'm not a graphic designer, so I can't fully speak to how it would help them, but just from the way I've seen him obsess over this ad from the 80s, ad from the 90s, look at the fonts they use.
I know a guy just like this.
Well, we probably know the same guy.
She
Then actually, he would like, we're looking at the headline that, oh my god, Buhari did this. We just look at the ad in the corner like, look at this font. So
he literally like left his work, like working full time in his studio to like build type.
typefaces.
that's passion.
Yeah.
That's passion.
It's that one.
Yeah, but
Super
that
interesting.
part, that part.
Yeah,
the
but
money
just
is
to add
there.
to it, I know I come from the tech side. Fonts, in tech communicate identity. They communicate a story, and it's something that you see with brands. No one is just going to go out and pick a font from the available fonts. Everyone wants to sit down and say, what can I create that communicates my brand, my product, my identity? And so just going through historical fonts, in a way, it's just a window to our identity.
Yeah.
And
how
logos.
we've communicated. Over time.
Logos too.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I like that you mentioned that archiving will be covering different regions. So something I'm really interested in is the history of the Yorubas. So it's a good thing when you said they're like, Yoruba newspapers that were, from way back when. So you can actually see the historical context at the time. I mean, there's this book called A History of the Yorubas, but I think it would... Yeah, I haven't read it, but I think newspapers would just offer way deeper context and insights. Yeah.
Just to add, I'm very interested in that. I got to France, and at my first year in France, I was struggling with the language, and I met this guy. Spoke French very well, and then I said, "What's your name?" He said his name is Olakunle. I said,
Sir.
how is that possible? How are you, Olakunle?
Yeah.
And he said he's from Benin Republic.
Wow.
I was like,
It's another angle.
and then he started speaking.
Exactly.
Exactly, and then he started speaking Yoruba to me. I was like, nah, you're joking.
Yeah.
Like I said to him, Yoruba is only in Nigeria. Like no, the Yoruba is all over.
Yeah.
And the way we would do it was when I wanted to get something or when the French was too complicated, he would go with me. I would speak to him in Yoruba. He would speak in French.
Wow.
And I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting there are Yorubas in Brazil as well.
Yes,
I
heard about
yeah.
that unity.
This isn't the new point. This isn't the new point. And it might take from a couple of things that have been said. But when I think of in general, I feel like when I've said this, when I think of archiving, and I'll say different things, this is the final one. One is timelines. The other is product development. But I would explain timelines first. So everything that we've said about, people knowing what has happened in the past helps you with decisions from now. And so imagine timelines across pop culture, across trends, across literature, across tech, across development, across economics, just the timeline of events, right?
Yeah.
That is Nigeria. That's one. The second, which I've now called product development, I'm actually thinking of product as in industries. We don't have to make the same mistakes that we've made in the past, but the only way that will happen, that we're not constantly doing the going from 0 to 1 rather than 1 to 100. It's actually knowing what the fuck happened with 0 to 1. So then.
Yeah. One interesting thing I'd like to add before I go to like the last question is, it's jollof rice, right? That's quite frankly, it's my most selfish use case for archiving. I spoke to one woman in 2019. She was in her late teens, early 20s in Nigeria's 40s and 50s. She grew up in Kano, right? She was telling me about how Kano was like a hub of industry. She was telling me about how they had canned jollof rice.
What?
And I was like, so she's an old woman, right? So I cannot even say like, stop bothering me, right? Because I'm respectful of my elders, right? But I found that very interesting. But I was like, you know what? If she feels so strong about it, then it probably happened. Fast forward to last year, when we first went live with archiving, these two siblings reached out. They live in the US, they're white, and we got on this call and they showed me pictures of living in Nigeria in the 60s, right, when they were kids. Their dad was a diplomat, and it was just very interesting. And they talk about one experience where they went to someone's house who was trying to impress them, and the person like offered them canned salads. And I'm like, okay, canned salad sounds more horrible than canned jollof rice. And suddenly it just felt possible, right? But the final thing with jollof rice is that I have a theory that I need to validate with the archives. My theory is that jollof rice didn't become mainstream in Nigeria until the 70s. And my argument is that when you speak to old caterers, they tell you that in the 60s, if you go to a party, they offer you like pounded yam and amala. Nobody offers you rice because we used to pick rice as a people the way we grew up picking beans, right? So that was how we speak rice. And it was in the 70s when the production of rice shot up. Because there was no middle class rice. There was only picking rice or Uncle Ben's. Nobody loves people enough to cook Uncle Ben's at a party.
That is true.
It's quite expensive, right? And so the influx of Asian rice just created this middle class rice that suddenly scaled across. All the work we're doing, 5 million pages. Question. Which leads me to like the last question, right? Which is, you suddenly had, I said we've only made 1% progress with 50,000 pages, and our North Star is 5 million pages. What is one specific thing you're going to make if you had 5 million pages?
AGI.
Let me just sell my market a little. My name is Kiki Mordi. I'm the founder of Document Women. To be honest, ever since I worked on radio, I think people just knew me for one thing, carrying women's matter on my head. And then documentation it became so important to me when I started to learn about, women. I was always advocating there are not enough women in leadership, not enough women in government. And so this lady asked me at a conference, there are not enough women world leaders, or can you name the ones that are there? I was like, oh, okay, I don't know that. We just lumped all of them into women in leadership. So I became very insistent on naming and just documenting women from that moment on. So if I had how many million pages?
5 million pages.
I would pick out all the women's faces in all the historical events. Independence, who were the women involved? I know that the women were not sitting down doing nothing. What's so special about us today as women that we feel like the fire that we have, they didn't have, our parents didn't have, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers didn't have. They felt the oppression that we felt, and some of them in their heart of hearts said they didn't want to survive like this anymore. Some of them in their heart of hearts did not love cooking. They just felt like they had a voice in decision-making and they fought to be at that table, even though they may have been erased. If there is any sliver of hope, if there is any shadow of their influence that I can find on those pages, I would love to bring it to the front and maximize it, magnify them, because I so much believe that Nigerian women it's in our DNA. You know, we've done this thing before. You know, I don't believe in reincarnation, but the way I'm feeling inside of me, I just know that my grandma, even the ones that were like, I met my grandmother. She was such a me, you know, in her own way. My mom is such a me in her own way. So I'm like, no, it didn't start from just my grandmother. For her own grandmother must have been like that, but I don't know anything about her because, well, no one documented them. So that's what I would do with million pages of archive.
That's our mandate. Yeah, 5 million pages. It's I feel like I feel it. Surprise me.
AGI.
Yeah.
Artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
So
That's the
that,
one that's supposed to kill us. AGI won't kill us.
Everyone, but
In Jesus' name.
I'm on your side, AGI. If you're listening.
I think there's so many use cases around AI, and if I had 5 million pages, I'll just start to explore those use cases. Build one, model that completely understands our past, understands where we are, and can, help chart a course to get out of where we are. And not so much as AGI as per the movies, but AGI as a helper that can, bring the trends to the fore, help understand that even when we're making decisions that seem right, they're not. We're just repeating failures of the past. But but everything around predictive analysis, 5 million pages, I would want to cross-reference that with financial data and be able to predict the terrorist attack before it happens, right?
Mentalist.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do.
Okay, 5 million pages.
I think I'm very interested in resistance movements. And like I've said, I feel like newspapers play such an important role in that. And something I'll be interested in looking at is just some of these resistance movements from years ago. I was reading Shoinka's We Must Set Forth at Dawn. I can imagine like newspapers probably had accounts of that, or different struggles that people had in the past, just fighting for values like freedom and democracy. And I feel like there isn't enough context of that today. So that's something that I would really, really like to look into. I also believe writers are guardians of truth. So again, when it comes to our history, there's a lot that has been covered up in propaganda, and so it would just be great to have like the authentic stories from newspapers. And the last one is related to culture. You raised a point on culture. I don't know if the Paystack 70. So I came.
National Observer has fantastic coverage of Paystack.
What
National
article?
Observer.
Wow.
Many of them do, but
Yeah, I came across a New York Times article by a Black American woman who attended the festival in the 70s. And I was just in awe of the story. And I can't imagine the Nigerians, obviously, that were there, that probably even had their own accounts in newspapers. So that's something I'm really, really looking forward to reading.
5 million pages.
I had 3, but thankfully I've said heroes, so please pardon me to say 2. The first is something that I'll just call an economic and business history textbook for Nigeria right now. So I've spoken about the economic one already, and that we really don't know the context of what happened in the economy. But when you look at different businesses as well, right? So even take something like Mr. Biggs, right? It was the Mr. Biggs, and then it has almost gone, right? And it is, if I hope it doesn't ever completely shut down, but if it does, it's going to leave with the billions of information and lessons about commerce in Nigeria. You see, there are businesses that were huge in the 80s that there's no trace of today, right? And here you are a startup founder, entrepreneur, and starting a business, and there's so much you can learn from those guys. Yes, the environment is different, there's technology, the geography has changed, etc., right? But rather than, going to read Harvard Business Studies, case studies, or in complement to that, right? I think there's so much about documenting our business, commercial, and economic history that can be so useful for people in a practical sense who are trying to navigate the commercial terrain today. And then just the last thing is that I'm very big on myths and stories. The very few times I write, I try and slot in the quotes and myths and stories in there. I find that a lot of mine are international because a lot of our myths and our stories are oral in Nigeria. But I do think that quite a bit of it was documented, right? I'm pretty sure that these papers have poems that people just sent in that are now lost to time, supposedly, right? Some of the poems that I know are like written in 1980 and published in the Times. I'm like, why do I know that? Why do I know the one in Nigeria, right? So just being able to actually do like a collection of stories and myths and poems and plays and different things that people just wrote that can again inspire the next generation and just actually be consumed for the fun and pleasure of it because these were your people and somehow that resonates even more. And we don't have that, right? We have Shakespeare. Shakespeare's not ours.
Okay.
What am I supposed to answer that?
Let's go.
Okay, cycle of trends, and it's very similar to that. But so the thing about cycles is that they just help you make better decisions. If I study the oil and gas boom, I kind of get a sense of what's going to happen with the tech boom. So cycle of trends, for the things we like, for food, for just in general, the cycle of trends, pop culture. That's the first thing. But specifically, a project that would definitely come out of that is the evolution of Nigerian music. And I didn't say the evolution of Nigerian pop. I mean music in the different variations that they've existed and the different variations that they've either from grassroots gone popular. Like, I don't know how many people know the story of Daddy Shoki, for instance. It was a legend in Ajigule. It was quite popular outside as well, but I'm sure there is a level or, a certain access on the next person and the next person after that who probably will not know that story. And it's very selfish. I know it sounds like something I'm going to publish on Zikopo. It is just this extremely selfish. Those are the top two things in my head.
Okay. I had no idea what to expect. But like it has been extremely insightful. I hope it was insightful for everyone too. Thank you so much for taking the time. Even I came here let us explore unlimited utility for archiving, and now my brain has stretched a little more. I appreciate that. I hope your brains are also stretched. So thank you. If anyone who watched it to this point, I wish them 5 million pages. To wrap.